Jake Morrison wiped the sweat from his forehead as he checked the mining equipment one more time. The familiar hum of machinery filling the cramped workspace of Asteroid Station Alpha 7, his calloused hands moving with practiced ease over the control panels that had become second nature after 3 years of working the Outer Rim mining operations, the loneliness of deep space work balanced by the good pay and the knowledge that his work helped supply Earth with rare minerals needed for the growing space colonies, though sometimes he missed the green hills of Montana where he grew up before joining the Marines and later finding his way to this remote corner of the solar system. The first sign that something was wrong came as a low vibration through the station. Hull, different from the usual sounds of the mining equipment or the life support systems that kept 200 workers alive in the cold vacuum of space, Jake paused in his work and looked up at the status display that showed all systems normal. But his military training had taught him to trust his instincts, and something felt off about the way the station was moving. A subtle shift that made him reach for the communication panel to contact the bridge. Before he could make the call, the lights flickered and went out for 3 seconds before emergency power kicked in, bathing everything in red light that made the familiar workspace look alien and threatening. The communication system crackled with static and then went dead completely, leaving Jake in the eerie silence broken only by the hum of backup power and the distant sounds of confused voices echoing through the station corridors. As other workers realized something was happening, Jake grabbed his emergency kit and headed for the main corridor where he found other miners gathered in small groups, their faces showing the same confusion and growing fear that he felt. Bill Chen from the drilling section was trying to reach the bridge on his portable communicator but getting only static, while Mary Foster from life support was checking the emergency protocols on her tablet, her usually calm demeanor cracked by uncertainty about what was causing the power fluctuations. The station shook again, and this time everyone felt it. A rolling motion that should have been impossible for a structure anchored to the asteroid. Jake looked through the nearest observation window and felt his blood run cold as he saw ships approaching the station, sleek vessels that moved with impossible grace through space, their hulls seeming to shimmer and bend light in ways that hurt to look at directly. Clearly not human in origin and far more advanced than anything Earth had ever built, the alien ships surrounded the station with movements that seemed almost like a dance, precise and coordinated in a way that spoke of technology and intelligence far beyond human capability. Jake counted at least 6 vessels, though it was hard to be sure as they seemed to phase in and out of visibility, their surfaces reflecting the light of distant stars in patterns that made no sense to human eyes trained to understand conventional spacecraft design. Without warning, the station's artificial gravity cut out and everyone began floating, the sudden weightlessness causing panic among the miners who were not trained for zero-gravity operations like military personnel. Jake used his Marine experience to grab handholds and help steady some of the floating workers while trying to make sense of what was happening, his mind racing through possibilities, none of which seemed adequate to explain ships that could disable a space station without apparent effort. A new sound filled the station corridors, a harmonious tone that seemed to come from everywhere at once, rising and falling in patterns that almost sounded like music, but carried an alien quality that made everyone stop talking and listen. The sound grew louder, and Jake realized it was some form of communication, though the meaning was completely beyond human understanding, like listening to whales sing in an ocean of space. The first aliens appeared in the main corridor without any sign of how they had entered the station. Tall figures that stood nearly 8 feet high with elongated limbs and bodies covered in what looked like natural armor with a crystalline quality that reflected the emergency lighting. Their faces were hidden behind masks or helmets that pulsed with soft blue light, and they moved with fluid grace that made human movement seem clumsy and awkward by comparison. Jake tried to organize resistance among the miners, but the aliens carried devices that emitted beams of light causing instant paralysis without apparent injury. Workers who tried to run or fight simply froze in place with their muscles locked, but their minds still aware. watching helplessly as more aliens entered the station and began herding the human crew toward the docking bays with the same calm efficiency that farmers might use to move livestock. Dr. Kevin Blake from the science section attempted to communicate, with the aliens using standard first contact protocols, speaking slowly and clearly while making peaceful gestures, but the creatures responded only with that same harmonious tone, occasionally pausing to study him with what seemed like mild curiosity before continuing their systematic collection of every human on the station, treating the doctor's attempts at communication with the same polite indifference they showed to resistance. As Jake found himself being guided toward an alien vessel, he caught a glimpse through a window of Earth in the distance, a blue dot that suddenly seemed impossibly far away, and he realized with growing horror that this was not just an attack or invasion, but something much worse, a harvest of human beings by creatures who saw them as nothing more than interesting specimens to be collected and studied. The casual efficiency of the operation suggesting this was routine work for the aliens rather than their first encounter with humanity. The last thing Jake saw before being loaded into the alien ship was the space around Alpha 7 filled with more vessels than he had initially counted, a fleet that suggested this operation was much larger than just one mining station, and as the human workers were secured in holding areas that seemed designed specifically for containing various types of life forms, Jake understood that Earth itself might be in danger from beings who possessed technology and power beyond human imagination. The journey to the alien world took what felt like weeks, though time became meaningless in the holding chambers where Jake and the other miners found themselves trapped in conditions that were comfortable enough to keep them alive, but clearly designed for containment rather than comfort. The walls pulsed with the same blue light as the alien masks and seemed to respond to their presence by adjusting temperature and airflow automatically, while food appeared through slots in the walls. At regular intervals, nutritious but bland substances that tasted like nothing Jake had ever experienced. When the ship finally stopped moving, Jake felt a change in the artificial gravity that told him they had landed somewhere, though the holding chambers had no windows. To show where they might be, the harmonious alien sounds grew louder and more complex, as if many voices were joining a conversation just beyond human hearing. And then the walls of the chamber simply dissolved, leaving Jake and his fellow prisoners standing in what appeared to be a vast processing facility filled with beings from dozens of different worlds. The first thing that struck Jake about the new environment was the sheer scale of the operation. Processing stations stretched as far as he could see in all directions, with different areas clearly designed for different types of life forms, some filled with water for aquatic species, while others had atmospheres that glowed with strange colors. The efficiency and organization suggested this facility had been operating for a very long time and handled thousands of different species on a regular basis. Amy Carter appeared at Jake's side as they were moved through the processing area, a young woman with short brown hair and intelligent eyes who had been captured from a different human colony ship. She had been in the facility for 6 months and knew enough about how things worked to help guide Jake through the initial confusion. Her presence was reassuring in the alien environment where everything seemed designed to make humans feel small and insignificant. The processing itself was surprisingly gentle, the aliens using scanning devices that passed over each human without physical contact while recording information on crystalline tablets that seemed to store vast amounts of data. Jake felt the scanners examining him in ways that went beyond simple medical examination, as if they were mapping not just his physical body but something deeper about his nature as a human being. The aliens worked with the same calm efficiency they had shown during the capture, treating humans like livestock being cataloged for future reference. Amy explained in whispers that the facility was located on a planet called Kepler 442b by human astronomers, though the aliens had their own name for it that humans could not pronounce. The world had been converted into a massive prison and research facility containing representatives from hundreds of different species collected from across the galaxy. Each group housed in environmental zones designed to replicate their homeworlds as closely as possible, creating a vast zoo of intelligent life. The human zone, designated as Zone 7, turned out to be an artificial environment that looked remarkably like Earth, complete with forests and grasslands and even a small ocean. But Jake could see the subtle signs that it was all artificial. The sky had a slightly wrong color, and the sun never quite moved the way it should, while the boundaries of the zone were marked by invisible barriers that prevented anyone from wandering too far. The illusion was impressive, but it was still clearly a prison designed to keep 50,000 humans contained and comfortable. Jake learned from Amy that the aliens called themselves something that translated roughly as Zephyrians, though their actual name involved harmonics that human vocal cords could not reproduce. They had been collecting intelligent species for millions of years as part of what they considered a conservation effort, believing that younger civilizations would inevitably destroy themselves if left alone, so they preserved representatives in controlled environments where they could study them and keep them safe from the dangers of technological advancement. The revelation that hit Jake hardest was Amy's explanation that humans were considered particularly valuable specimens because of their adaptability and unpredictable nature. Most species that the Zephyrians collected followed predictable patterns of behavior, but humans consistently surprised their captors with new responses to captivity. Some became depressed and passive, while others formed complex social structures, or developed new technologies using available materials. This unpredictability made humans fascinating subjects for long-term study. Amy introduced Jake to other humans who had been in Zone 7 for years, including Commander Lisa Hayes, who had been a military officer before her capture and now led an underground resistance movement among the human population. Hayes was a stern woman with gray streaks in her dark hair and eyes that held the kind of determination that came from refusing to accept defeat even in impossible circumstances. She had been working for 5 years to understand Zephyrian technology and find weaknesses that might be exploited. The resistance met in hidden locations throughout Zone 7, using knowledge of the environment that the Zephyrians had not anticipated. Hayes explained that while the aliens monitored human behavior, they did not seem to understand the depth of human capacity for deception and organization. They expected their prisoners to behave like animals in a nature preserve rather than intelligent beings capable of planning and coordination. This blind spot had allowed the resistance to gather information and prepare for eventual action. Dr. Kevin Blake joined the resistance after several weeks of being subjected to behavioral studies where Zephyrian researchers tested human responses. To various stimuli, the experience had shown him that the aliens were not just keeping humans as pets, but were actively studying them for purposes that remained unclear. His scientific background allowed him to understand some aspects of Zephyrian technology, and he began working with Hayes to map out the facility's weaknesses and develop plans for resistance. Jake found his role in the resistance when his demolitions. Expertise from his Marine days became valuable for understanding how Zephyrian technology might be disrupted. The aliens used crystalline power systems that followed patterns similar to conventional electronics, but with properties that seemed to involve manipulation of space and energy in ways that human science had never achieved. Jake began studying these systems, looking for ways that his knowledge of explosives and engineering might be applied to alien technology. As weeks passed, Jake realized that the comfortable prison of Zone 7 was designed to make humans forget about escape and resistance. The environment provided everything needed for survival and even comfort, but it was still a cage designed to contain an entire species. The Zephyrians watched their prisoners with the same detached interest that human scientists might show toward laboratory animals. And Jake understood that unless the resistance found a way to fight back, humanity would remain specimens in an alien zoo forever, their freedom and their future stolen by beings who believed they were acting for humanity's own good. Jake spent his first month in Zone 7 learning everything he could about Zephyrian society from the other prisoners who had been studying their captors for years. The aliens operated with a rigid hierarchy that seemed based on age and accumulated. knowledge rather than individual achievement, with the oldest members making decisions for the entire species based on millions of years of experience. Their society had achieved technological mastery over most of the known galaxy, and they genuinely believed they were helping lesser species by protecting them from the dangers of uncontrolled development. Commander Hayes shared intelligence that the Resistance had gathered about Zephyrian reproduction, a complex process that required genetic material from multiple species to create new offspring. The aliens had transcended natural biological reproduction eons ago and now used advanced technology to combine traits from different life forms, creating hybrid Zephyrian children who inherited beneficial characteristics from various species. This explained why they collected so many different types of intelligent life and why they were particularly interested in species that showed high adaptability. The discovery that humans were being used as breeding stock for alien reproduction filled Jake with a cold rage that burned deeper than simple anger at being imprisoned. Dr. Blake had learned from his time in the research facility that human genetic material was especially valuable because of its flexibility and resistance to modification. Zephyrian scientists could extract useful traits from human DNA and incorporate them into their own reproduction process, essentially stealing the best qualities of humanity to improve their own species. Amy had managed to establish contact with prisoners from other zones through a careful network of communication that avoided Zephyrian monitoring. She learned that the prison planet held representatives from thousands of different species, some of whom had been captive for centuries, while their home worlds were either destroyed by natural disasters or stripped of resources by Zephyrian mining operations. The aliens saw themselves as saviors preserving the last remnants of these civilizations, but the reality was that they were tomb keepers maintaining a graveyard of stolen cultures. Jake's engineering background proved crucial when he began analyzing the crystalline technology that the Zephyrians used for everything from power generation to communication. The crystals operated on harmonic frequencies that could be disrupted if the right resonance patterns were applied. His experience with explosives had taught him how different materials responded to vibration and pressure, and he realized that Zephyrian technology might be vulnerable to precisely timed disruptions that could cascade through their entire system. Dr. Blake provided the scientific foundation for Jake's theories about Zephyrian weaknesses. His time in the research facility had shown him that the aliens relied heavily on their technology for everything and had little experience dealing with problems that required improvisation or creative thinking. They had been the dominant force in the galaxy for so long that they had forgotten how to adapt to unexpected challenges. Their strength had become a weakness because they could not imagine that primitive species might find ways to threaten their advanced civilization. Resistance began planning their first major operation, using information about Zephyrian patrol patterns that Amy had gathered through careful observation. The aliens maintained a regular schedule for monitoring Zone 7 that followed predictable timing. They clearly expected their human prisoners to behave according to established patterns and did not anticipate that humans might be studying their captors as carefully as they were being studied. This overconfidence created opportunities for action that a more paranoid species would never have allowed. Hayes explained that previous resistance efforts had failed because they focused on trying to match Zephyrian technology rather than exploiting its weaknesses. Earlier groups had attempted to steal alien weapons or communication devices, but these items were designed to work only for Zephyrian operators. However, Jake's approach of targeting the underlying power systems offered a new strategy that might actually succeed where direct confrontation had failed. Jake began gathering materials from throughout Zone 7, using his knowledge of chemistry and engineering to identify substances that might be useful for creating improvised weapons. The artificial environment contained many Earth-like materials that could be processed into explosive compounds if properly prepared. The Zephyrians had been so thorough in replicating human habitat that they had inadvertently provided the tools needed for resistance. Their attention to detail in creating a comfortable prison had given their prisoners access to the materials needed for escape. Amy discovered that the Zephyrians maintained detailed records of every species they had captured, including the location. Of their original home worlds, the database contained precise coordinates for Earth, along with extensive information about human civilization and technology. More disturbing was evidence that the capture of Alpha 7 was just the beginning of a much larger operation. The aliens were planning systematic harvesting of Earth's population to gather enough genetic material for their reproduction programs. The Resistance made contact with other species in different zones and learned that many had given up hope of escape after decades or centuries of captivity, but Jake's success in understanding Zephyrian technology began to change attitudes among the prisoners. Species that had accepted their fate as permanent captives started to believe that resistance might actually be possible. The network of communication between zones grew stronger as word spread about human ingenuity in finding ways to threaten their captors. Dr. Blake made a crucial discovery when he realized that Zephyrian society had not faced serious opposition. For millions of years, their entire culture was built around the assumption that they were naturally superior to all other forms of life and that resistance from captive species was simply impossible. This arrogance created blind spots in their security and management of the prison planet. They monitored prisoner behavior but did not expect coordinated resistance that used their own technology against them. Jake's military training became increasingly important as the Resistance prepared for direct action. His experience in unconventional warfare provided strategies that other prisoners had never considered. The Zephyrians expected their captives to behave like animals in a zoo rather than soldiers planning a military operation. Their surveillance systems were designed to monitor individual behavior rather than detect organized group activities, creating opportunities for coordinated action that could take the aliens completely by surprise. The final piece of intelligence that convinced Jake to move forward with active resistance came when Amy learned that the Zephyrians were planning to relocate the human population to a more restrictive facility. The aliens had noticed increased organization among their human prisoners and were preparing to transfer them to a maximum security zone where escape would be impossible. This news created urgency for the Resistance because they might not get another chance to strike back against their captors before losing what little freedom they still had. Jake spent 3 weeks preparing for the assault on Zone 7's control center using materials he had gathered from throughout the artificial environment. His improvised explosives were crude compared to military-grade equipment, but they were designed specifically to exploit the harmonic frequencies that Dr. Blake had identified in Zephyrian power systems. The crystalline technology that seemed so advanced and mysterious actually followed predictable patterns that could be disrupted by precisely timed vibrations, giving humans their first real weapon against alien superiority. Commander Hayes coordinated the timing of the attack with other resistance cells throughout Zone 7, using Amy's communication network to ensure that multiple targets would be hit simultaneously when the surveillance system went down. The plan required split-second timing because the Zephyrians would respond quickly once they realized their monitoring equipment had been compromised. But if everything worked correctly, the Resistance would have 6 hours of unmonitored time to prepare for larger operations against alien control. The control center was located in a crystalline structure at the heart of Zone 7 that most humans avoided because it seemed to pulse with alien energy. But Jake had studied the building during his weeks of preparation and identified the points where his explosives would cause maximum disruption to the power grid. The aliens had built their technology to be beautiful and efficient, but they had not considered that prisoners might turn their own power systems into weapons against them. Amy provided the distraction that allowed Jake to approach the control center by organizing a cultural festival that drew Zephyrian attention to the other side of Zone 7. The aliens were fascinated by human social behavior and always sent observers. When prisoners gathered in large groups, their curiosity about human culture created the perfect cover for Jake to plant his charges at the base of the crystalline power collectors that fed energy to the surveillance network. The explosions, when they came, were more spectacular than Jake had expected. The harmonic disruption cascaded through the entire Zephyrian power grid, causing crystalline structures throughout Zone 7 to crack and shatter in chains of destruction that the aliens clearly had never experienced before. Their technology was so integrated that damage to one component affected multiple systems, proving that advanced civilization could be just as vulnerable as primitive technology when the right weaknesses were exploited. With the surveillance system down, Jake and Amy led a carefully planned infiltration of the research facility where Dr. Blake was being held for behavioral studies. They had memorized the layout from intelligence gathered by other prisoners and knew exactly where to find the human scientists who were being subjected to Zephyrian experiments, but reaching the research facility required crossing open ground, where they would be exposed to any remaining alien defenses. The research facility turned out to be a complex of interconnected buildings where the Zephyrians conducted experiments on various species. Jake could see holding areas containing creatures from dozens of different worlds as he made his way through corridors designed for beings much taller than humans. The aliens had been studying prisoner behavior for so long that they had accumulated vast amounts of data about how different species responded to captivity. But they had never studied how species might respond to freedom. Dr. Blake was found in a testing chamber where Zephyrian researchers had been monitoring his responses to various stimuli. The scientist looked exhausted, but his eyes lit up with hope. When he saw Jake and Amy approaching, he had been pretending to cooperate with the alien experiments while actually gathering intelligence about their research methods and the weaknesses in their security protocols. Information that would be crucial for future resistance operations. The rescue attempt went wrong when Zephyrian guards detected their presence before they could reach Dr. Blake. Jake found himself facing 3 alien guards, who moved with the same fluid grace he had observed during the initial capture, but this time he was prepared for combat rather than being taken by surprise. His military training and knowledge of Zephyrian technology gave him advantages that the aliens had not anticipated. Jake's first kill came when he used an improvised weapon based on harmonic disruption to shatter the crystalline armor that protected a Zephyrian guard. The alien's expression of surprise was visible even through its mask, as it realized that a primitive human had found a way to penetrate defenses that had protected Zephyrians for millions of years. The guard died quickly, but its death sent shock waves through the alien command structure that had never lost personnel to captive species. The firefight that followed demonstrated the difference between a species that had been apex predators for eons and humans who had evolved as both hunters and prey. Jake used guerrilla tactics that the Zephyrians could not counter because their own combat experience was limited to overwhelming technologically inferior opponents. They had no experience fighting enemies who used improvisation and desperate creativity instead of superior firepower. Amy proved equally deadly when she used her knowledge of Zephyrian communication systems to turn their own coordination network against them. By introducing false signals into their harmonic communication, she caused confusion among the guards who received contradictory orders about how to respond to the human attack. The aliens had never faced an enemy who could manipulate their technology. From the inside, Dr. Blake's rescue was successful, but it came at a cost. The resistance had revealed capabilities that the Zephyrians had not suspected, and the alien response was swift and brutal. Within hours of the attack, additional guards were deployed throughout Zone 7, and new security measures were implemented that made movement much more difficult for human prisoners. The aliens also began threatening to relocate the entire human population to a maximum security facility. The intelligence that Dr. Blake brought from the research facility changed everything for the resistance. He had learned that the Zephyrians were planning a massive expansion of their Earth harvesting operation that would involve capturing millions of humans for their reproduction programs. But more importantly, he had discovered weaknesses in alien technology that could be exploited on a much larger scale than anything the Resistance had attempted before. Jake realized that the successful attack had marked a turning point in the relationship between humans and Zephyrians. For the first time in their long history, the aliens were dealing with captive species who could kill their guards and disrupt their technology. The psychological impact was as important as the tactical success because it proved that humans were not helpless victims, but dangerous opponents who could threaten Zephyrian superiority. The news of Jake's success spread through the communication network to other zones where prisoners from different species began to see humans as potential allies, rather than just another group of captives. The kill ratio that Jake had achieved against Zephyrian guards was unprecedented in the history of the prison planet, and his tactical innovations began to influence resistance movements among other species who had given up hope of fighting there. Captors Commander Hayes understood that the resistance now faced a critical decision point. They could continue with small-scale operations that would eventually be suppressed by increased security, or they could escalate to a full-scale uprising that would either free the prisoners or result in their complete destruction. But Jake's demonstration that humans could kill Zephyrians had changed the calculations for everyone involved in the growing rebellion against alien control. Word of Jake's victory against the Zephyrian guards spread throughout the prison planet faster than the aliens could contain it. Prisoners from hundreds of different species learned that the seemingly invincible captors could be killed by clever tactics and improvised weapons. Jake's name became a symbol of hope in zones where despair had reigned for centuries. And for the first time since their capture, many species began to believe that escape might actually be possible if they worked together against their common enemy. The Zephyrians responded to the growing unrest by implementing increasingly harsh security measures that only served to fuel more resistance. They restricted movement between zones and increased surveillance. But these actions proved that the aliens were afraid of their prisoners for the first time in millions of years. Jake realized that fear was a weapon more powerful than any explosive, because it forced the Zephyrians to make defensive decisions instead of maintaining their usual confident control over the situation. Amy's communication network became crucial for coordinating resistance activities across the planet as Jake began, teaching other species the tactics he had developed for fighting Zephyrian technology. Each species brought unique capabilities to the growing rebellion. Aquatic creatures could move through water systems that the aliens had not secured, while crystalline beings could interface directly with Zephyrian technology in ways that organic species could not match. The diversity that the aliens had collected for their research became a strength for the resistance. Dr. Blake's intelligence about Zephyrian weaknesses allowed Jake to develop increasingly sophisticated attacks that targeted critical infrastructure throughout the prison facility. The aliens had built their systems to be efficient and integrated, but this meant that damage to key components could cascade through multiple networks. Jake's engineering background helped him identify choke points where a small amount of destruction could cause massive disruption to alien operations. The first major test of the expanded resistance came when Jake led a coordinated attack on the power generation facility that supplied energy to multiple zones. The operation required precise timing, as teams from 6 different species struck targets simultaneously. While Jake's group penetrated the main reactor complex, the Zephyrians had never faced organized military action from their prisoners, and their response was confused and ineffective. Jake's tactical innovations continued to evolve as he learned more about Zephyrian psychology and technology. The aliens relied heavily on their advanced systems, but they had little experience with opponents who could think creatively under pressure. Their combat doctrine was based on overwhelming superiority rather than adaptive tactics, making them vulnerable to guerrilla warfare methods that emphasized speed and unpredictability over direct confrontation. The psychological impact of the successful attacks began to affect Zephyrian behavior in ways that created new opportunities for the resistance. Guards became nervous and made mistakes, while researchers abandoned long-term studies to focus on immediate security concerns. The aliens, who had been calm and confident for millions of years, were experiencing something they had never known before: The fear that their captives might actually threaten their entire civilization, Amy established communication with resistance cells on other prison planets throughout the Zephyrian Empire using captured alien equipment that Dr. Blake had modified. For long-range transmission, the discovery that similar uprisings were beginning on other worlds gave Jake's movement access to intelligence and resources that multiplied their effectiveness. The network of rebellious prisoners began sharing tactics and coordinating larger. Operations Commander Hayes planned the assault on the planet's primary communication array using intelligence gathered from multiple successful raids. The facility controlled all transport to and from the prison world, and its destruction would isolate the planet from the rest of the Zephyrian Empire, cutting off reinforcements and preventing the aliens from relocating troublesome prisoners to more secure facilities. But the mission would require the largest coordinated action in the history of the Resistance. The battle for the communication array demonstrated how far human tactical thinking had evolved during months of guerrilla warfare. Jake's forces used diversionary attacks to draw Zephyrian defenders away from critical targets, while specialized teams moved through maintenance tunnels that the aliens had never thought to secure. The fighting was fierce, but Jake's understanding of alien weaknesses allowed his troops to inflict casualties far beyond what should have been possible. Jake's reputation as a deadly opponent spread among the Zephyrian guards, who began to fear. Encounters with human fighters, the aliens had never faced enemies who combined primitive weapons with advanced tactical thinking. Jake could turn any environment into a battlefield using materials that the Zephyrians considered harmless. His ability to improvise weapons and tactics made him unpredictable in ways that their computer systems could not anticipate or counter. The destruction of the communication array marked a turning point in the rebellion because it proved that prisoners could achieve strategic objectives against Zephyrian infrastructure. The aliens found themselves cut off from their command structure for the first time in their history, while facing coordinated attacks from species they had considered primitive and harmless. Jake had transformed a prison population into an effective military force. Dr. Blake's analysis of captured Zephyrian equipment revealed that the aliens were struggling to adapt their technology to counter human innovations. Their systems were designed for efficiency rather than security. Because they had never faced internal threats, Jake's weapons and tactics exploited fundamental assumptions about how their technology would be used, forcing the aliens to redesign. Systems that had remained unchanged for millions of years, Amy coordinated with newly freed species to plan attacks on Zephyrian facilities throughout the galaxy, using the communication network to share Jake's tactical innovations with Resistance. Movements on dozens of worlds. The human approach to warfare was spreading faster than the aliens could develop countermeasures, proving that adaptability was more valuable than technological superiority when facing determined opposition. The Zephyrians began to experience something their species had never known: the fear of being hunted by their own prey. Jake's forces could strike anywhere at any time using tactics that seemed impossible to predict or prevent. The aliens, who had collected thousands of species for study, were learning that their captives possessed capabilities that their research had never discovered, and that hubris could be more dangerous than any weapon Jake realized that he had become, something the Zephyrians could not understand or control. A primitive being who had turned their own strengths against them, his success in combat and tactics had made him a legend among the prisoners while creating panic among the guards. The aliens who had seen humans as interesting specimens now faced the terrifying reality that they had captured something far more dangerous than they had ever imagined. The final phase of the rebellion began when Jake's forces achieved complete control over multiple zones while cutting off Zephyrian command and control systems. The prison planet that had been a symbol of alien dominance was becoming a fortress of resistance that threatened to spread rebellion throughout the galaxy. Jake had evolved from a simple mining engineer into the nightmare that would haunt Zephyrian dreams for generations to come. The planet-wide uprising began at dawn, when Jake's signal went out across every zone simultaneously, coordinated through Amy's communication network that now linked resistance cells from hundreds of different species, the attack was more massive and organized than anything the Zephyrians had faced in millions of years of galactic dominance. Prisoners who had been docile captives just months before were now disciplined fighters using tactics that Jake had developed specifically to exploit. Alien weaknesses, Jake led the assault on the Central Command facility, while teams from dozens of species struck targets throughout the planet. The Zephyrians found themselves fighting on multiple fronts against enemies who seemed to know their technology better than they did. Dr. Blake's intelligence about alien systems had been shared among all the resistance cells, allowing even the most primitive species to disable advanced Zephyrian equipment with precision strikes. The fighting was unlike anything in recorded galactic history, as species that had been natural enemies in their homeworlds now fought side by side against their common captors. Jake's tactical innovations had spread throughout the resistance movement, but each species added their own unique capabilities to create a combined force that the Zephyrians could not counter. Their attempts to predict prisoner behavior failed completely when faced with coordinated action from beings they had never expected to cooperate. Amy's role in coordinating the uprising proved crucial, as she maintained communication between widely separated battle groups while directing resources to where they were needed most. Her network had grown from a simple prisoner communication system into a sophisticated command and control structure that rivaled Zephyrian military organization. The aliens who had monitored individual prisoner behavior had never anticipated that humans could organize such complex operations. The Zephyrians made their first major tactical error when they activated automated defense systems that had been dormant for centuries. The ancient weapons were designed to suppress large-scale revolts, but they operated according to programming that could not distinguish between different types of prisoners. Jake realized that the defense systems could be turned against their creators by manipulating the targeting protocols that Dr. Blake had helped him understand. Jake's assault on the Central Command facility became a nightmare for the defending Zephyrians as he used their own defensive systems against them. The automated weapons began targeting alien defenders when Jake introduced false signals into their identification network, causing chaos among troops who suddenly found themselves under fire from their own equipment. The battle demonstrated how completely Jake had mastered the art of turning advanced technology into a weapon. The psychological impact of the uprising spread beyond the prison planet as news of the rebellion reached other Zephyrian facilities throughout the galaxy. Species that had been captive for centuries began organizing their own resistance movements using tactics that Jake had developed. The network of communication that Amy had established allowed successful strategies to spread faster than the aliens could develop. Countermeasures. Dr. Blake's analysis of captured Zephyrian vessels revealed that the aliens had never developed defenses against internal threats because they had never faced serious opposition from captive species. Their ships and equipment were vulnerable to the same harmonic disruption techniques that Jake had used against ground installations, giving the resistance access to transportation and weapons that could threaten Zephyrian positions throughout the galaxy. The climactic battle for planetary control lasted 3 days as Jake's forces systematically destroyed every major Zephyrian installation while capturing equipment and personnel that would be crucial for future operations. The aliens who had seemed invincible just months before were now retreating from positions they had held for millions of years, their confidence shattered by opponents they had never learned to understand or respect. Jake's reputation as a military leader reached legendary status when he personally led the final assault on the planetary defense grid, using improvised weapons and guerrilla tactics to overcome defenses that had been considered impregnable. His ability to adapt and improvise under pressure made him unpredictable in ways that Zephyrian computer systems could not anticipate, turning every encounter into a demonstration of human superiority in unconventional warfare. Amy's communication network evolved into a galactic resistance movement as liberated species from the prison planet contacted other captive populations throughout Zephyrian space. The tactical innovations that Jake had developed were spreading faster than the aliens could adapt their defenses, proving that ideas could be more dangerous than any weapon when they inspired desperate beings to fight for their freedom commander. Hayes coordinated the liberation of other prison planets, using captured Zephyrian vessels that Dr. Blake had modified for resistance operations. The fleet that Jake had helped create was composed of ships from dozens of different worlds, but united by shared hatred of their former captors. The diversity that the Zephyrians had collected for research became a strength that they could no longer control or contain. The final phase of the planetary rebellion came when Jake's forces achieved complete control over all Zephyrian facilities, while establishing the infrastructure needed to support ongoing operations against alien positions throughout the galaxy. The prison world that had been a symbol of Zephyrian power was now a base for resistance operations that threatened to spread rebellion to every corner of their empire. Jake stood before the massive fleet of captured vessels surrounded by representatives from hundreds of liberated species who had pledged their support for the coming war against Zephyrian civilization. His transformation from mining engineer to galactic resistance leader was complete, but he understood that the real fight was just beginning. The aliens who had captured him, expecting to study another primitive specimen, had instead created their own worst nightmare. The Zephyrians who had ruled the galaxy for millions of years now faced the terrifying reality that their captives possessed capabilities that their research had never discovered. Jake's success had proven that technological superiority meant nothing against opponents who could adapt and innovate faster than established systems could respond. The hunters had become the hunted in a war that would determine the future of countless civilizations. Dr. Blake's final analysis of Zephyrian society revealed that their greatest weakness was the arrogance that had prevented them from understanding the true nature of the species they collected. They had seen prisoners as specimens rather than potential enemies, and that blindness had allowed Jake to develop the tactics and strategies that would ultimately destroy their galactic empire. The nightmare they had created would haunt them until their civilization fell. Amy's communication network now spanned multiple star systems as liberated species coordinated attacks on Zephyrian positions throughout the galaxy. The rebellion that had started with one human's refusal to accept captivity had grown into a galactic war that would reshape the balance of power among the stars. Jake Morrison, the former mining engineer, had become the leader of the greatest uprising in galactic history. The story concluded with Jake preparing to take the fight directly to the Zephyrian homeworld, using a fleet of captured vessels and an army of former prisoners who had learned that freedom was worth any sacrifice. The aliens who had once dismissed humans as primitive livestock now faced an enemy who had proven that determination and adaptability could overcome any technological advantage. The nightmare was complete, and the galaxy would never be the same.